Good afternoon, everyone. And hi, I'm Jenny Whitener with Bridge Innovate, and we are thrilled to welcome you to today's very special presentation by Mitch Weisburgh. It's going to be an exciting 30 minutes. I'm glad that you've joined us. Today, planning for failure, a fun topic, right, that we encounter often in our businesses. Mitch is going to take us through that topic and exploring complex problems and how to solve them. So very exciting that you're with us today. Thank you for joining, and we'll be introducing Mitch along the way. So let's keep going. So today, we are happy to welcome you once again to Bridge Innovate's Inspire series. At Bridge Innovate, we are a global network of business strategists and consultants and leaders who work alongside your organization to create defining moments for growth and good. We've been pleased. This has been an amazing Inspire series for 2020, and it's amazing to have Mitch with us today. We've had speakers from all segments of business and industry, and even in the nonprofit sector. But it's great to have Mitch with us today. So without further ado, let's move on and introduce him. Mitch Weisburgh is the co-founder and director of two businesses and many more, actually, if you look at his bio on LinkedIn. He's quasi-entrepreneur and expert in a number of different segments of industry, especially in the education sector. He's co-founded EdChat Interactive and Academic Biz. And you can see how to reach both those websites here on his bio, edchatinteractive.org or academicbiz.com. Mitch's expertise is in strategic planning and accelerated learning and systems design. You'll see an extraordinary bit of background on his LinkedIn profile in the education sector. He's founded and grown two companies in education and training field, and is really seen as a strategic advisor for school districts throughout the United States. And just in getting ready for today's call today, he mentioned about being online with 5 district leaders just in the state of New York just this week. So we're excited that he's here with us today. He brings a lot of specialty in online training and education and in building expertise around online training and implementing financial marketing and distribution plans. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mitch to share with us a bit more about his background. Mitch and I reconnected through the RSA, where we're both fellows based out of London. And so it's great to have you with us today, Mitch. Please share with the group a bit more about yourself and take us through your presentation.
Well, thank you, Jenny. I have to say it's been a pleasure working with you and with Mary. When we start with the slides that I produced were basically kind of black and white, and they have really spruced them up, so they're very much for your efforts. My background for the past 20 years, really, I've been working in the education sector, advising organizations that want to reach more kids, mostly in the US and mostly in K-12. And that's what I've been doing with Academic Biz. With EdChat Interactive, that's something I do as a labor of love. We have educators who are doing really interesting things, and they share what they're doing with other educators. And we do them in kind of an interactive webinar format. And then I should also say I am interim COO for the US for a company called 3D Bear. 3D Bear is a Finnish ed tech company that allows kids to create, they create scenes and movies using augmented reality on whatever topics their teacher is having them study. So basically, that's me. Plus, I love to taste wine. And let's start. So let's move to the first slide, or the next slide. So, and Mary, you're advancing the slides? Okay, good. Okay, so what we're going to be covering today is, actually the previous slide now. Mary, can we go to the previous slide, the one that with the agenda? Or yes, okay. So basically the topic of today's session is planning for failure. And in planning for failure, we're going to go over, how do we make good decisions, how they go wrong, making sure that we understand short-term failure is going to happen, but that could lead to long-term success, elements of the things that we should be doing in order to contribute to success, and then 5 ways to be successful. We thought we'd start with you all, and maybe you can fill in the chat as we go to the next slide on how is failure regarded in your organizations, or how do you think it should be regarded? And we'd love for you to go to go to the chat and type in some of the things like, is failure regarded as a plus or as a minus? Is it penalized? Is it rewarded? Should it be treated differently in your organizations? And maybe I can comment on some of the items. Yeah, as long as it doesn't cost too much money, right? It's valuable, but if it ends up costing you. So that's an interesting, and we're going to be going into that in a minute, is that as we plan for failure, we want to be doing things that are safe to fail, as opposed to fail safe, which are things that absolutely have to work out. Yes, failure. Thank you, Jeff. Yes, failure can be considered as learning, and that it's a stepping stone towards success. That's what we try to do. And it's interesting how we say that that's what we want in education also, and yet we're failing kids for not doing well on tests. We're failing kids for being a day late on an assignment. And yes, we pretend failure didn't happen, but it really, failure should be celebrated. There are times where we're doing things and there's a high likelihood that it's not going to work. But just trying it advances us towards our end goal. Good. So let's move on. So I'm still seeing the old slide, but basically, we're all taught in classical decision making that it's critical to come up with the best course of action, and that's why we plan. So the way we've all been taught to do this is, start off taking a look at all the different alternatives that we have, understanding the consequences of each alternative, comparing them, which are better, which are worse, coming to the best course of action, and then executing them. And I think that, we've all heard of the Ben Franklin method, which is you come to a decision, you're trying to figure out what the best way is to do something, and you write all the positives on one side of a piece of paper and all the negatives on the other side of the piece of paper, and whichever wins, that's what you end up doing. We've all learned about game theory, where you kind of map out, these are all the things that could happen, here's the probabilities that they will happen, here's how much they benefits, here's how much it's worse, here's what it will hurt us if it doesn't work out, and then doing a calculation, and that's going to determine the best decision. And the problem is, in real life gets in the way. And let's move on to the next slide. Because as we consider complicated or complex actions, there are a lot of things that get in the way. And Mary, can you move on to, so you okay. Got it.
Just as we keep going, we're seeing the slides progress when you say smooth them, and for some reason they're a bit delayed on your end.
Okay.
So
okay.
We're all seeing them in real time, but I don't know why it's delayed on your end. So just a little logistics update there. We're seeing them.
Okay. All right. So here are the types of things that really get in the way of that type of decision making, because we can't look at all the alternatives. Because sometimes you look at things and there's ambiguity. You really can't tell, is it like this or is it like that? Sometimes unexpected things happen. Who knew 18 months ago that COVID was going to destroy our economy? We couldn't have predicted that. Sometimes there's innovation. Take a look at Nokia as an example. If we had if we'd taken a poll probably 12 years ago, what cell phones are using, 70% of us were using Nokia phones. And then Apple came up with a smartphone. Who has a Nokia phone today? Sometimes innovation gets in the way. Sometimes there are just too many variables. I mean, look at a chess game. We can't calculate all the different possible chess moves and which is the best. So sometimes there's just too many variables. Whenever we're dealing with people, and we make decisions and we take actions, by taking an action, we're affecting the people. The people change, and once the people change, they affect the system. Like as soon as we measure something, or as soon as we reward people for doing something, their actions change, sometimes in ways that we can't predict, and sometimes in ways that affect the results much more than we could have expected. I'm not sure how, Heisenberg uncertainty principle really comes from physics, where it says you can measure on small particles, you can measure their velocity, or you can measure their location, but you can't measure both. And so you always have a degree of uncertainty. Well, we found that this applies to people as well. As soon as you start measuring people, they change. And so what you're measuring isn't what you thought you were going to be measuring. Some of what we know and some of what's important can't be measured. How do you measure happiness? We can't measure happiness. We can't really measure pain. We can't measure love. And yet we know that those things are important. Sometimes there are just unknowns. I remember when we went into the Iraq War and we said, we just have to, we have to proceed even though there are things that we will never know. Sometimes we're dealing with people and they have biases or hidden assumptions. When I see that, I think of Apple with their face recognition software on the phones, and they tested this extensively on their employees. But the problem is that the employees that they tested on were all Caucasians. And so they ran into problems with their facial recognition when people of color, of course, started buying the phones, and it really wasn't working with them. We don't necessarily know what those hidden assumptions are and what biases exist when we're sitting down and planning. And then anything that we're doing that's meaningful, we're going to find people who are against it. And every time we take an action, they're going to take an action also. And we can't necessarily predict what their actions are going to be. So we have all of these things that are working against our traditional ways of planning. And so if we moved on to the next slide, the other thing that holds us back, in addition to real life complexity, which is over on the left, is the way our mind sometimes trips us up. And so, one of the ways the mind trips us up is that very often we don't know what we don't know. And matter of fact, when you talk about, say, the 4 stages of improving, you start off with unconscious incompetence. Like, we don't even know what we don't know. And then conscious incompetence. So at least if we know that we don't know something, we could start taking action. And then conscious competence, where we have to think about what we're doing. And then unconscious competence, where we're doing it so well we don't even have to think about it. But the fact that we very often don't know what we don't know kind of prevents us from using planning. I think there's a great quote by Nobel laureate Thomas Schelling. One thing a person cannot do, no matter how rigorous the analysis or how heroic the imagination, is to draw up a list of things that would never occur to them. So another way the mind tricks us up is when we think we know what we're going to be doing, and we think we have some expertise, but in fact, we don't. And I'm sure that we've all run into cases where we thought we knew what we were doing, we got into the middle of it, and all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, I really don't know what to do next. The third way is another interesting way that our minds as people, the way our minds work. We find patterns. Our brains are designed to find patterns. We look at point, and we construct a story based on those points. But sometimes we confuse correlation, things that are just happening at basically the same time, with causation. We find patterns or we find stories, and that trips us up when we try to plan in advance. And then the fourth thing is another interesting aspect of the mind, and this comes from fMRIs that they've taken on people's minds as they're making decisions. Decisions are made in the parts of the mind that really control the emotions. And then after those decisions are made, you then see the cognitive areas of the brain start firing up. So in fact, we may think of other people as rationalizing instead of reasoning, but if we're people, we all do this. We come to a decision and then we rationalize rather than the ability to reason out first. So when you put all these things together, how real life is too complex to necessarily plan, and that our brains are sometimes working against us, what we come up with on the next slide is that whatever we decide to do, probably it's not going to work. And so that then de-emphasizes the decisions that we make. Not that we shouldn't be planning and not that we shouldn't be trying to come up with decisions, but probably the first thing that we do or the first things that we do aren't going to work. And if we move on to the next slide, yes, they're probably not going to work, at least not the first time. And if we go on to the third slide in this sequence, it's yes, what we're going to do is probably not going to work. At least it's not going to work the first time. So in order to make them work, what we really need to do is we need to build initial failure into our plans to succeed. And we need to think about, well, how does that change the way we plan? Maybe instead of taking all this time and figuring out exactly what the best course of action should be, maybe we should start thinking instead about, well, how are we going to react when we start getting feedback about the things that we're doing? And so as we move to the next slide, that's really the crux of what we want to get accomplished, we want to get across today, is that preparing for the fact that the things that you're first doing aren't going to be successful means that you have to be prepared to iterate. Now, there's many different systems that allow you to do that. There's lean, there's agile. The one that I tend to gravitate to is probably the first one, and it was called, OODA, for observe, orient, decide, and act. And it was created by a person named John Boyd. John Boyd was an Air Force fighter pilot starting off in the time of the Korean War. And he was the best fighter pilot that there ever was. He used to challenge other Air Force pilots to start where he was in front of them. His plane was in front of them. He was in their sights. And his statement was, within 40 seconds, I will technically shoot you down. And he would bet, and to my knowledge from what I looked up, he never lost a dogfight. And you can find out more about him. There's a QR code on the right. There's a URL here that on the right as well. He's just a really interesting person. He helped design the F-16 fighter jet. He helped design the F-15 fighter jet. He was the person who was responsible for a strategy in the first Iraq War, where he won in 3 days by overwhelming the enemy. And his thoughts, starting as being a fighter pilot, then as being a military advisor, then as being a strategic advisor to the military, to governments, and to corporations, is that you need to prepare to loop through actions very fast. First, observing or sensing what was happening around you, and the better you could do that, the better decisions you could make. Then figuring out what your possible actions are and how they would affect other things. Then next, deciding which action or actions you're going to take, doing the act, and at the same time as acting, then observing what are the results of your act. And his insight was that the people who did this, or the groups or the companies or the organizations that did this and did this better and faster than other organizations, were the organizations that would win. That's how he won his fights. That's how when he designed the F-15, I should say, if you think about a fighter jet, you would think that the fighter jet that's fastest or could turn in the smallest radius would be the fighter jet that would win in a battle. But in fact, the fighter jet that could change directions and change speeds fastest was the one that eventually won. So the US fighter jets were lighter, less expensive, slower, and had poorer turn ratios than the MiGs that they were fighting. And yet they consistently won because the fighter pilot himself had a much larger field of vision, and and because the plane was so much lighter, he could change direction a lot faster than the MiGs. And that's how he advised countries on strategy, and that's basic strategy that we used going into that first Iraq War. So his OODA loops were actually a lot more complex than what's shown on the screen. And if you go on to the next slide, where the full OODA loop is shown, this is a diagram that we actually created based on his diagram. But you look at these 4 steps: observe, where you're taking in information; orient. In the orientation, in the orient step, what you're doing is you're drawing on previous experiences. You're pulling in any new information you can get hold of. You're using as many different mental modes as you can. You're looking at the culture of your organization and other organizations. You're taking that information, you're analyzing it, you're coming up with new possible actions. And then based on what you come up with, you're then deciding what you're going to do, and you're acting. And take a look at all these feedback loops here. You're observing, and then you're orienting. But from orienting, you're also observing how you're orienting. Are you doing this successfully? Then you're deciding. Well, when you're deciding, you're also observing, how are you making the decisions? Are you making decisions well? You're acting, and then you're observing, what are the results of the actions and how well are we acting? And then that feeds back into orienting again, so you're reorienting. He regarded the orient step as the key step in OODA loops. And he said that the 2 biggest errors that groups made was, first, going too quickly from observe to decide. And we do this all the time. We see something and then we decide we're going to do this. That's mistake number 1. And if you take a look at corporate strategy, when corporations actually consider 2 or more different course of actions and go through that orient step before deciding on a particular act, they tend to be successful 70% more of the time than if they merely take what their first action was and then plan based on their first action. So the first thing is, companies and organizations and people who disregard that orient step tend not to do well. And the second big thing is that what we're trying to do is they're trying to get to the act stage. And too often we spend so much time in the orient stage that we never get to the act stage. And so where we want to be is somewhere in the middle. We want to orient, but we want to orient and come up with acts where we can get great information so that we can then observe and get feedback from, and then reorient, decide, and act. And that's our goal. So the question is, if the goal is to come up with reasonable acts, then what consists of a reasonable act? What types of things should we be looking at? So if we go on to this next slide with orient and good probes, here are some of the attributes of what a good act is. First of all, and I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, a good action has to be safe to fail. If you do it, and if it doesn't work out, are you still alive? Can you come back and try something else? So first, are you safe to fail? Second, you shouldn't be doing something unless it plausibly is going to work. That doesn't mean you really think it's going to work, but you should be able to come up with an explanation about why it should work so you can get feedback and so that you can come back and try something else. Some of the things that you try should be low probability but high reward. Now this, there's I forgot his name, but there's a stock market analyst who specializes in picking out situations where there's less than a 2% chance that he's going to be successful. But if he's successful, he's going to make 1,000 times his money. So some of the things that you try have to be these low probability, high reward things. Some of the things that you try, you should believe that they're going to fail, even though plausibly they could work. But if they're going to give you great information for you to come back and improve what you're doing, you should be trying them anyhow. It's helpful to try opposites. Things that I know both of these can't be successful, but one of them might be. And so try both of them and get the information from them. It's hard to rate one thing as more important than anything else, but diversity in the group of people who are making the decisions and doing the orienting is critical. If you have a mix of sexes, you have a mix of age groups, you have a mix of economic strata, you have a mix of ethnicities, then you're going to be making a much better decision that's much better able to take into consideration all the different forces that are going to be acting on your actions, and much more reflective of society. So diversity in the orientation group, in the orienting group, diversity also intends on yourself. So the more varied background you have, the better you're going to be able to orient and the better your actions are going to be. As you come up with the actions before you act, you need some criteria for evaluating the results and analyzing the results. Some of the things that you try should be indirect. I think one of the best examples of this is it was one of these, I guess, self-help columns where somebody wrote in that said, you know, my fiance, we're getting married, and my fiance and I both think that it'd be nice to have flowers, but the flowers that she really wants are going to be much, much more expensive than what we can afford. How can I persuade her to change? And the answer came back is, well, you can't just say these are too expensive. You can't try a direct approach. But maybe you have to understand what she's going through. You know, you all are thinking of flowers because flowers are beautiful and they're fresh and they may be appropriate for a wedding. But maybe you can also mention to her that, you know, flowers fade very rapidly. And so maybe you could say to her, you know, our wedding, we're in love forever. Maybe we want something more permanent to represent our wedding than flowers. What do you think? So a more indirect approach very often will work. And then multiple probes in parallel. If you think about it and you do one thing and get the results, another thing and get the results, you know, it could take a long time before you get enough information to get it correct. But if you can try 3 or 4 or 5 different things at the same time and get information on all of them, maybe you can bypass that and make it a lot faster. So as you're thinking about the different things the different types of actions, running your actions through this list and saying, well, gee, do I really think that they could work? Are some of these things low probability, high reward? Are any of these conflicting and maybe I could try both of them? Is there any way I could try both of them? Is my group diverse enough? Running your actions and running your orienting group on those criteria could be important, because if as we move to the next slide, what's key is not that you're going to succeed with any of these actions, but that you're able to gather information so that as you run through and iterate over and over again, you're getting the best information to be able to start moving towards success. And just looking again at the OODA loop. So, and looking at all these feedback, what you want to know is, if all the way on the right, there's act. Your act, you want to be able to observe what are the actions that you're doing, what are the results of those actions, how does that affect the actions of others, what are the reactions that are taking place from your group, What's the emotional state of the people in your group and or anybody who's opposing you? And how is this affecting potential allies and adversaries? And those are the types of things you want to be observing based on your actions. And, you know, I haven't been looking at the chat. Oh, and I see that we are at time. Oh, so let me quick then go to examples. So I did want to come up with a couple examples. So if you look at the Finnish education system, which is which is known as one of the best education systems in the world, and you look at how they reacted to COVID versus the U.S. education system, you see the Finnish system had tremendous success. If you look at Amazon versus Barnes and Noble, Amazon is a great example of an organization that deploys this type of thinking, whereas Barnes and Noble did not. And then we can move on to, I'd say, slide number 19, which is really the 5 things that I'd like you to take out of this, is that as you're making decisions and as you're coming up with courses of action, understand that whatever you decide, that's merely the first of a series of actions. As you take actions, be prepared to obtain feedback from your actions, evaluate those actions based on the feedback and come up with new actions. Be prepared to go through that cycle many times. Be prepared to go through that cycle faster and better than anybody who opposed you. Do that more quickly than your adversaries. Those are the 5 things that I'd like you to take out of this session. And I hope that you found this helpful. And I guess if we have time for questions, that'd be great. And if we didn't, I'm sorry that I took so long.
No, it was wonderful. Thank you, Mitch. Very intriguing. And I can't wait to, what did you call it? The OODA?
OODA, the OODA loops, OODA.
I'm like, let's do the OODA. It feels like
yeah, OODA, right?
right. I love it. So it's a very simple but very effective way to help organizations have that dynamic approach. So thank you so much for sharing your perspective today and joining us as a speaker on the Inspire series. We are short on time for Q&A, so I would just invite you, if you have questions, to follow up with Mitch. You can find him on LinkedIn. And he's got his contact information there. And then join us for some of our other upcoming Inspire webinars. We have Dr. Greg Morris coming up on October 2nd, and John Tavis coming up on October 14th, and Kristen Lottie Bryant on October 22nd. And we hope to see you again in another Inspire event. It's been great having you here today. You guys have a great weekend. Thank you, Mitch.
Okay, thank you. Okay, take care. Bye.